Ilhan Omar just made the single most catastrophic miscalculation of her entire tenure in Washington, D.C. She looked a decorated former Secret Service agent in the eye and called him a racist cop on live television during a congressional hearing. Big mistake. Catastrophic mistake. Dan Bongino's response. Congresswoman, since we are discussing character, shall we discuss your marriages? All three of them. What happened next will effectively end her political career forever. Smash that like button right now because you are about to witness the most devastating, systematic political takedown in the history of the United States Congress. This former NYPD officer and Secret Service agent, a man who stood guard outside the Oval Office to protect the leader of the free world, is about to expose everything with documented, irrefutable evidence that will shock you to your absolute core. Ilhan Omar thought she was untouchable. She thought her identity, her gender, and her religion would protect her from scrutiny. She thought calling her critics racist was a magic wand that would make the evidence disappear. She was wrong. When you attack someone who spent 12 years investigating complex fraud at the highest levels of the federal government, you better be ready for total war. This is bigger than any political scandal you have ever seen. This is the day America discovered that one of the most protected politicians in Congress has been running a fraud operation for over a decade. It was a Tuesday morning in the nation's capital, the kind of humid, heavy day that often hangs over the swamp of Washington, D.C. But inside the Rayburn House office building, the temperature was controlled, cool, and deceptive. The air conditioning hummed with a low, constant drone, a white noise that usually lulls spectators into a trance during these interminable committee meetings. The House Judiciary Committee had convened for what was listed on the docket as a routine hearing on border security and interior enforcement. It was supposed to be standard political theater, the kind where members read prepared statements, witnesses give 5-minute summaries, and everyone goes home to catch the evening news cycle. But the tension in the room told a different story. Even before the gavel fell to bring the session to order, there was a palpable electricity in the air, a static charge that pricked the skin of every veteran reporter in the gallery. They knew who was on the witness list. They knew who was sitting on the dais. The seating chart alone was a recipe for combustion. Sitting at the witness table, composed, motionless, and radiating a dangerous kind of calm, was Dan Bongino. To the uninitiated, he might have looked simply like another pundit or a former law enforcement officer invited to give a conservative perspective. But to those who understood the language of body calm, Bongino was broadcasting something else entirely. He sat with the stillness of a predator waiting in tall grass. His suit was immaculate, his posture rigid but relaxed, his hands resting gently on the table in front of him. But it was his eyes that gave it away. He wasn't scanning the room nervously. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't drinking water to clear a dry throat. He was staring straight ahead, focusing his mental energy, visualizing the encounter that he knew was inevitable. This was a man who had spent 12 years in the Secret Service, a job where a split second of hesitation means the difference between life and death for the President of the United States. He had been trained to detect threats, to analyze trajectories, and to neutralize dangers before they could manifest. Today, however, the threat wasn't a gunman in a crowd. It was the Congresswoman sitting 3 seats down from the center of the dais, shuffling her papers with an air of dismissive arrogance. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar looked comfortable, too comfortable. She sat in her high-backed leather chair, the symbol of her congressional authority, adjusting the microphone with a practiced flick of her wrist. She leaned over to whisper something to the aide crouching beside her, a smirk playing on her lips. She had done this 100 times before. She had faced critics, she had faced outrage, and she had always won. In her mind, the script was already written. She would wait for the witness to say something about the border. She would interrupt with a point of order or a question about his rhetoric. She would accuse him of xenophobia, clip the video for social media, and watch the donations roll in. It was a formula that had worked for her entire career. Attack the attacker, claim victimhood, weaponize identity. She looked down at Bongino, not as a threat, but as a prop she intended to use to boost her engagement numbers. She didn't see the folders. She didn't see the thick, heavy stack of documentation resting just out of sight near Bongino's left hand. She didn't see the trap. Chairman Jordan brought the gavel down, the sharp crack echoing off the wood paneling, signaling the start of the proceedings. The opening statements were standard fare. The Republicans spoke about the rule of law and the crisis at the border. The Democrats spoke about humanitarian concerns and the legacy of asylum. It was the usual partisan waltz, a dance everyone in D.C. knew by heart. Bongino waited. When it was finally his turn to speak, he leaned into the microphone. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried the distinctive, flattened vowels of New York City, a voice that resonated with millions of working-class Americans because it sounded like home. It sounded like the guy at the end of the bar who knew what he was talking about. It sounded like the cop who showed up when you called 911. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me today," Bongino began, his tone the definition of professional courtesy. "My testimony draws on 12 years of federal law enforcement experience, including investigations into human trafficking, financial fraud, and operations that exploit our immigration system to undermine national security." He paused, letting the credentials hang in the air. He wasn't speaking as a podcast host. He was establishing his baseline. He was reminding everyone in the room that before he was a media figure, he carried a badge and a gun for the federal government. He had spoken for maybe 90 seconds, barely getting into the substance of his prepared remarks regarding border vulnerabilities when the interruption came. It was sharp, aggressive, and designed to derail his momentum. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman." The voice cut through the room like a jagged piece of glass. It was Omar. She didn't wait to be recognized. She didn't wait for the witness to finish his sentence. She leaned forward, her finger jabbing toward the witness table, her face contorted in a mask of righteous indignation. She had become an expert at this, at creating the viral moment, at positioning herself as the moral authority while launching vicious attacks on her opponents. "I question whether this witness should even be allowed to testify before this committee." The room erupted in a low murmur. Papers rustled. Heads turned. This was a breach of decorum even for a contentious hearing. Witnesses were invited guests of the Congress. To challenge their right to speak before they had even finished their opening statement was aggressive even for her. But Omar pressed forward, sensing she had the floor, sensing the cameras were now zoomed in tight on her face. This was her moment. Mr. Bongino is nothing more than a right-wing conspiracy theorist with a documented history of Islamophobic rhetoric and divisive hate speech. She was reading from a prepared script now, her eyes darting down to the paper and back up to the cameras. "This man," she continued, pointing a long finger directly at Bongino, "is just another racist ex-cop who has built an entire career on xenophobia and attacking marginalized communities. He doesn't belong in this hearing room. His presence here is an insult to the dignity of this body." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and toxic, racist. It was the nuclear option. It was the word designed to end conversations, to destroy reputations, to silence opposition. In the modern political climate, it was an accusation that usually caused the accused to stammer, to apologize, to retreat into defense. Omar sat back, crossing her arms, a look of triumphant satisfaction on her face. She had dropped the bomb. Now she would watch the explosion. She expected Bongino to get angry. She expected him to yell, to turn red, to pound the table, to give her the clip of the angry white man that she could fundraise off of for the next month. The cameras whipped around to capture Bongino's reaction. The directors in the control booth were screaming for a close-up, expecting rage. But what they captured instead was terrifying in its composure. Dan Bongino sat perfectly still. He didn't blink. He didn't frown. Slowly, imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a slight, cold smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster who watches his opponent move their queen directly into a line of fire. It was the expression of someone whose opponent has just walked blindly, arrogantly, into a trap that had been set weeks in advance. He let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. In the world of television, 3 seconds of silence is an eternity. It forces everyone to lean in. It sucks the oxygen out of the room. He was forcing the entire committee, the entire press gallery, and the millions watching at home to wait for him. When he finally spoke, His voice was quieter than before, but it possessed an absolute authority that seemed to vibrate through the mahogany tables. "Congresswoman Omar," he said, holding her gaze across the room, refusing to look at the chairman, refusing to look at the cameras. "Let me respond to your accusations directly, since you have chosen to make this personal." He reached down to his left. The movement was slow, deliberate. He lifted the thick folder onto the table. It landed with a heavy, dull thump that echoed in the silent room. That sound, the sound of paper hitting wood, was the first warning shot. "You called me a racist," Bongino continued, his voice steady, devoid of the anger she had desperately wanted to provoke. "Let me establish some facts about my background before we discuss your record, Congresswoman." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal the metallic glint of a badge and the laminated card of his credentials. He held it up, turning it slowly so the committee members could see, so the cameras could focus on the eagle and the seal. "I spent 12 years protecting President Barack Obama, our nation's first black president. I protected him with my life. I stood post outside the Oval Office while he made decisions that shaped the world. I rode in the limousine. I walked alongside the family. I put my body between him and any potential threat." He lowered the credentials but didn't put them away. He left them on the table, a badge of honor and a shield of truth. "Does that sound like the resume of a racist to you? Do you think the Secret Service assigns racists to the inner circle of the first black president?" The question was devastating in its simplicity. It stripped away the rhetorical veneer of her attack and exposed it as a hollow, lazy slur. But Bongino wasn't done defending himself. He was pivoting. He was going on the offensive. "But since you have decided to question my credibility on national television," he said, his hand resting on the cover of the thick folder, his fingers splaying out over the cardboard, "let me ask you some questions, Congresswoman Omar." He flipped the folder open. It was packed. Hundreds of pages of documents, highlighted, tabbed, organized with forensic precision. This wasn't a prop. This was a case file. "Shall we discuss your marriages?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming darker, more serious. "All three of them, or should we start with the campaign finance violations? The $250,000 fine, the $2.8 million paid to your husband's consulting firm, the allegations of immigration fraud you have never addressed with a shred of evidence." Each question landed like a mortar shell. Boom, boom, boom. Ilhan Omar's expression began to transform. The smirk vanished, wiped away as if by a physical blow. Her eyes widened. Her posture shifted from relaxed arrogance to something approaching panic. She looked at her aide, but the aide was staring at the documents on Bongino's table with a look of horror. Chairman Jordan, a veteran of these fights, recognized instantly that something significant, something historic was unfolding. He saw the pivot. He saw that the witness had just become the prosecutor. "The chair will grant Mr. Bongino additional time to respond to the Congresswoman's charges," Jordan stated, ignoring the frantic signaling from the Democratic side of the aisle. "Mr. Bongino, please proceed." Bongino's smile widened just a fraction as he looked directly at Omar. He had the green light. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the American people deserve to hear some facts about Congresswoman Omar's record. Not the spin. Not the narrative, the facts." He extracted the first set of documents. They were copies of official marriage certificates, certified by the state, bearing the seals and signatures of clerks. "Congresswoman Omar, according to public records, records that are available to anyone who knows where to look, you entered into a religious marriage with Ahmed Hersey in 2002. He held up a document. "You had 3 children with him. You lived with him. You presented yourselves to the community as husband and wife." He placed that document down and picked up another. "Then, in 2009, you legally married a man named Ahmed Nursed Elmi." Bongino's tone was methodical, surgical. He sounded like a detective laying out a timeline to a jury in a homicide trial. "But here is the problem, Congresswoman. Here is where the math doesn't work. While you were legally married to Mr. Elmi from 2009 to 2017, you continued living with Ahmed Hersey. You filed joint tax returns with Hersey. You had more children with Hersey." He looked up from the papers, locking eyes with her again. "That is tax fraud. Congresswoman, filing joint tax returns with someone while you are legally married to a different person is a federal crime. It is not a mistake. It is not an oversight. It is a crime. But that isn't even the worst part. The real question, the question you have spent millions of dollars in legal fees to avoid answering, is who is Ahmed Nursaid Elmi, and why did you marry him? The room fell into a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the hard drives in the television cameras. Everyone in the room knew the rumor. Everyone knew the whisper. But no one, absolutely no one, had ever dared to say it to her face in an official proceeding. Multiple investigative journalists have presented evidence suggesting Ahmed Elmi is your biological brother, Bongino stated. He didn't shout it. He didn't scream it. He said it with the cold, hard weight of a fact. The evidence includes statements from the Somali community, school records from the United Kingdom, social media posts that you desperately tried to delete, and immigration patterns suggesting you married him to facilitate his student loans and his entry into the United States. Omar looked frozen. She was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She was watching her worst nightmare materialize in real time. Now you have dismissed these allegations as conspiracy theories, Bongino continued relentlessly. You call anyone who asks the question a bigot, but here is the reality. You have never provided a single piece of evidence to refute them. You have never submitted to DNA testing. You have never explained the timeline. You have never clarified why you filed joint tax returns with one man while married to another. His voice hardened, the police officer coming to the surface. In my 12 years as a federal agent, I learned a fundamental truth about human behavior. Innocent people provide evidence. Guilty people attack their accusers. Your response follows the guilty person playbook exactly. You deflect. You scream racism. You hide. But you never, ever show the proof. He reached into the folder again and produced an official letterhead document. But we don't have to rely solely on these allegations or rumors. We have findings. He held the paper up. In June 2019, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board fined you. They didn't warn you. They fined you for using campaign funds for personal expenses, including travel to meet Ahmed Elmi in London. He let that sink in. The official finding was devastating. This wasn't a conspiracy theory on a blog. This was confirmed misconduct by state authorities. So let me summarize this for the committee and for the American people watching at home. Congresswoman, the evidence suggests you married your alleged brother for immigration fraud. You filed fraudulent tax returns for years. You used campaign money, donor money, for personal expenses to visit him. And when questioned, you attack people like me as bigots to silence us. Bongino sat back in his chair, but his eyes never left her. Now you are welcome to respond with evidence. Right now. Release your tax returns. Agree to a DNA test today. Explain the timeline of the two marriages. If you are innocent, prove it. The floor is yours. Omar's response was halting, disjointed. Her voice, usually so sharp and projection-heavy, was thin. These are false allegations that have been debunked, she stammered. This is harassment. By whom? Bongino shot back instantly, interrupting her before she could regain her footing. Debunked by whom? Name one actual investigation that cleared you. Name one news organization that actually examined the marriage certificates and the school records. Name one. The silence that followed was damning. She couldn't name one, because there wasn't one. The media had simply taken her denial and printed it as fact. But that didn't work in a hearing room with a former federal agent holding the documents. That's just the immigration fraud, Congresswoman, Bongino said with a cold, terrifying smile. We haven't even scratched the surface. Shall we discuss the $2.8 million you paid to your boyfriend's consulting firm? Shall we discuss the E Street Group? The atmosphere in the committee room had shifted completely. What began as routine testimony had morphed into a systematic criminal prosecution being presented live on national television. The Democratic members of the committee were exchanging panicked glances. Aides were furiously typing on Blackberries and iPhones, trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding, but there was no way to stop it. The wound was open, and Bongino was just getting started. He reached for a new folder. This one was even thicker, bulging with Federal Election Commission reports, bank statements, and spreadsheets. His demeanor remained professionally calm, which made the explosive nature of what he was revealing even more potent. He wasn't ranting. He was dissecting. "Congresswoman Omar, let's move to something more recent and more easily documented," Bongino said, smoothing out a spreadsheet on the table. "Your systematic theft of campaign funds through payments to your husband's consulting firm." He arranged the FEC documents with precision, creating a visual timeline on the witness table. When citizens donate to campaigns, they are contributing to support election efforts. They believe they are supporting a cause. They are not donating to enrich candidates personally. What candidates cannot do, what is strictly forbidden by federal law, is use campaign money for personal expenses. That is federal embezzlement. That is grand theft. Bongino displayed a timeline chart he had prepared. It was large enough for the cameras to pick up the numbers. In 2018, your campaign began paying the E Street Group, a consulting firm owned by Tim Minett. Initial payments were modest, $60,000, then $85,000, standard stuff. He pointed to the spike on the chart. But then something changed. In 2019, payments exploded. First quarter, $230,000. Second quarter, $420,000. Third quarter, $680,000. He looked up, his eyes boring into hers. What changed? Did the political landscape shift? No, your relationship with Tim Minett became romantic. Bongino produced a new document, divorce papers. In August 2019, Tim Minett's wife filed for divorce. In her sworn filing, she specifically alleged that her husband was having an affair with you. Here is the quote from the court filing. "Defendant's travel and work hours now appear more related to his affair with Ilhan Omar than actual work. So, we have sworn testimony in a court of law that by April 2019, you were having an affair." And at that exact moment, the payments to his firm doubled. "Right," he said, nodding as if he was agreeing with himself. Then let's continue the timeline. By the end of 2019, $1.9 million paid. In 2020, another $900,000. In March 2020, you divorced Ahmed Hirsi. Later that year, you married Tim Minett. The progression was devastating when laid out so starkly. Affair begins. Payments explode. Omar divorces husband. Marries the consultant. Total amount paid from 2018 to 2020, $2.8 million. Bongino let that number hang there, $2.8 million. It was a staggering sum for a house race. Now, you will claim these were legitimate consulting fees. You'll say he's a genius strategist. So let's examine that using industry standards. He produced a comparative chart. The average house campaign pays between $50,000 and $100,000 per cycle for digital consulting. High-profile, competitive races might pay $200,000. Maybe. You represent Minnesota's 5th District, Bongino noted, his voice dripping with disdain for the inefficiency. Minneapolis. It is D+26. It is not competitive. You won with 74% of the vote. You face no serious general election opposition. Yet you paid one firm $2.8 million. That is 28 times the average. The mathematical disparity is irrefutable. It defies logic. Unless, of course, the purpose wasn't consulting. For that money, Tim Minett should have delivered the most innovative campaign in the history of Western democracy. Bongino mocked slightly. So, let's look at what you got. He displayed social media analytics. Your social media is unremarkable. Your website is a standard template design worth maybe $10,000. Your digital advertising was minimal. So, what did you pay nearly $3 million for? Bongino showed invoice summaries. These invoices list vague services, digital consulting, strategic communications, travel coordination. They are deliberately vague because they are disguising personal payments as business expenses, but we have evidence showing where the money actually went. He held up 3 fingers. Category 1, personal travel. Over $200,000 billed as consulting travel, but journalists tracked the actual trips. Luxury vacations to California, Miami, Martha's Vineyard, weekend getaways. This is you using donor money for romantic trips with your lover. Category 2, personal legal expenses. Over $500,000 billed as strategic communications, but actually paid to your personal lawyers defending you against immigration fraud allegations and handling your divorce. Category 3. Living expenses. Rent, groceries, dry cleaning, car payments, furniture, clothing, all billed as campaign expenses and funneled through Minot's firm. Bongino's voice hardened into steel. This is systematic theft, Congresswoman. You treated your campaign as a personal piggy bank. You laundered the money through your boyfriend's firm to bypass the laws that prohibit personal use of funds. Then he pulled out his most devastating piece of evidence for this section. On June 4, 2020, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board investigated and sanctioned you for exactly these violations. Let me read their findings. He put on a pair of reading glasses, a theatrical gesture that emphasized the scrutiny he was applying. The board finds that Representative Omar used campaign funds to pay for personal travel, personal legal expenses, and improperly reported expenditures to obscure the personal nature of spending. He took the glasses off. They fined you, one of the largest penalties in Minnesota history, and how did you respond? You paid the fine with more campaign money, another violation, and never admitted wrongdoing. In fact, you continued the exact same practices. Even after being caught, you paid his firm another $700,000. Bongino leaned forward, invading her personal space from across the room. This is grand theft and embezzlement. These are federal crimes carrying up to 20 years in prison. Chairman Jordan turned to Omar. The room was so quiet you could hear the blood rushing in ears. Congresswoman, do you wish to respond? Omar's voice was defensive, shrill, lacking the confidence she had walked in with. These were legitimate business expenses reviewed by the FEC. The FEC didn't review them, Bongino interrupted, his voice booming. Minnesota investigated and fined you. The FEC is notoriously understaffed and slow, but I am calling for a federal criminal investigation right now. He gathered his papers, slamming them back into the folder. That is the campaign finance fraud, Congresswoman, but we are not done, not even close. Let's discuss your anti-Semitism, your foreign policy betrayals, and your sympathy for terrorists. If the previous revelations about fraud had been devastating, what Dan Bongino was about to present next cut to something even darker. A pattern of hatred toward Jews, sympathy for America's enemies, and foreign policy positions that consistently undermined United States national interests. Congresswoman Omar, Bongino began, his voice taking on a tone of profound moral authority. I protected Jewish Americans as a Secret Service agent. I investigated terrorist threats. Your rhetoric isn't just offensive. It is dangerous. It puts lives at risk. He opened a new folder, black this time. Let's document your pattern of anti-Semitic statements and actions. He pulled out a sheet. February 2019. You tweeted, "It's all about the Benjamins," when discussing pro-Israel political support. You invoked the age-old anti-Semitic trope that Jews buy political influence with money. The House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning your remarks. Did you learn? No. March 2019. You suggested American Jews have allegiance to a foreign country. The classic dual loyalty trope used to question whether Jews can be loyal Americans. Again, widespread condemnation. Again, you doubled down. April 2019. Speaking about 9/11, you said some people did something, minimizing the worst terrorist attack on American soil. Bongino's voice shook with controlled rage. The terrorists weren't some people. They were al-Qaeda jihadists who murdered 3,000 Americans. I lost friends that day, Congresswoman. I knew guys who went into those towers and didn't come out. To hear a sitting member of Congress describe mass murder as some people did something is nauseating. These aren't isolated mistakes, Bongino declared, gesturing to the stack of papers. This is a pattern of minimizing terrorism, attacking Israel, and using anti-Semitic language. But it gets worse when we examine your foreign policy positions. He produced a speech transcript. In 2023, you told a Somali-American audience in Minneapolis, "We are people who know they are Somalians first, Muslims second." You are an elected American congresswoman who said your primary identity is Somali, not American. You took an oath to the U.S. Constitution, but you publicly declared your loyalty is to Somalia first. Bongino displayed voting records, holding them up for the cameras. Let's look at your votes on foreign policy. You consistently vote against sanctions on Turkey despite Erdogan's human rights abuses. You oppose support for Israel at every turn. You sided with Venezuela's Maduro regime. You vote against measures to counter Iranian aggression. The pattern is clear. You consistently support America's enemies and oppose our allies. He pulled out more documentation. In 2013, you described Al-Qaeda saying, "When you say Al-Qaeda, people get upset, but when you say America, nobody says anything." You literally compared Al-Qaeda terrorists who killed 3,000 Americans favorably to America. Regarding Al-Shabaab, the Somali terrorist group that has killed American soldiers, you have been notably reluctant to condemn them. Why? Because of your Somali identity that you have said comes before your American identity. Bongino's expression showed pure disgust. As a former federal agent who investigated terrorism, I am telling you, you represent a counterintelligence concern. You have foreign allegiances. You support hostile regimes. You minimize terrorism, yet you have access to classified intelligence. Our intelligence allies, British MI6, Israeli Mossad, have expressed concerns about sharing sensitive information with Congress because of members like you who cannot be trusted. He paused for effect, letting the gravity of the accusation land. But what is most disturbing is how you have been protected. When anyone criticizes these positions, you claim Islamophobia. The media shields you. Democratic leadership defends you. Speaker Pelosi watered down House resolutions condemning your anti-Semitism. She defended your different perspective. The squad circles the wagons. Legitimate criticism gets called bigotry. Bongino's voice cut like a knife. You have weaponized your identity to shield yourself from accountability. Your race, your religion, and your refugee status have been used to protect you from scrutiny that any white Christian would face immediately. But that protection ends today. The evidence of your anti-Semitism, your foreign allegiances, and your sympathy for terrorism is documented in your own words. Chairman Jordan looked troubled, his brows furrowed. Several Democratic committee members shifted uncomfortably in their high leather chairs, recognizing they could no longer defend the indefensible. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. Omar attempted a response, her voice trembling slightly. "These are deliberate distortions of my positions taken out of context." "Out of context," Bongino shot back, his voice booming. "You said some people did something about 9/11. What context makes that acceptable? Tell me. You said you are Somali first. What context changes that meaning?" Omar fell silent. Her mouth worked, but no words came. "That's what I thought," Bongino said coldly. "Now, let's discuss your connections to organizations with terrorist ties and your fundraising from foreign sources." The hearing had now been going for nearly 3 hours, and the systematic destruction of Ilhan Omar's credibility showed no signs of slowing. Each revelation had been more damaging than the last, peeling back the layers of her public persona to reveal the corruption underneath. And Dan Bongino clearly had more evidence prepared. "Congresswoman Omar," Bongino said, tapping a new folder. "Let's discuss your relationship with CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations." Bongino's law enforcement background gave immense weight to what he said next. "As a former Secret Service agent with counterterrorism experience, I am familiar with CAIR's history. Founded in 1994, CAIR was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terrorism financing case in U.S. history. The FBI cut ties with CAIR in 2009 due to concerns about Hamas connections. He displayed documentation on the screen. Yet you maintain close ties with CAIR. You were a community organizer with them before politics. You speak frequently at their events. You coordinate policy positions. You share staff members and donor networks. Why do you maintain ties with an organization the FBI refuses to work with due to terrorism concerns?" Bongino didn't wait for an answer. He was rolling now. Now, let's look at your fundraising, because there are serious questions about foreign money infiltrating your campaigns. He produced financial analysis reports, spreadsheets dense with data. Federal law prohibits foreign contributions to campaigns, but there are ways around it through domestic intermediaries. Your campaign shows unusual patterns. In 2019, you received $50,000 from 50 donors, all giving exactly $1,000, all on the same date, from addresses that don't exist. That is a classic straw donor scheme, where foreign money is funneled through fake American donors. You've received speaking fees from Islamic Relief USA, an organization with documented Hamas connections. The timing of these payments corresponds with key votes affecting Middle East policy. You received an unusually large book advance from a publisher with foreign ownership. Your first book had minimal sales, yet you got a huge advance, a potential money laundering vehicle for foreign payments. Bongino laid out the forensic analysis. I have used Secret Service financial investigation techniques to analyze your contributions. The patterns show geographic clustering, timing coordination, and amount standardization that indicate organized straw donor schemes and foreign money laundering. This is exactly what federal investigators look for in campaign finance fraud cases involving foreign money. He produced one final document for this segment, but we don't need to speculate because you have already been caught. In 2020, Minnesota authorities found that you violated campaign finance law by accepting contributions through illegal bundling schemes. You were fined for this, Congresswoman, just like you were fined for personal use of funds, just like you were fined for tax violations. There is a pattern here of systematic lawbreaking. Omar's defense was weak, almost inaudible. These donations were reviewed and approved. Reviewed by whom? Bongino demanded. The FEC that is understaffed and years behind on investigations, or the Minnesota board that actually investigated and fined you. He gathered the documents, stacking them into a tower of indictment. Here is what the evidence shows. You maintain ties with terror-connected organizations. You receive money through suspicious channels that suggest foreign influence. You have been repeatedly sanctioned for campaign finance violations. And when caught, you never admit wrongdoing. You just pay fines and continue the same practices. That is not the behavior of someone who made mistakes. That is the behavior of someone who believes she is above the law. Dan Bongino pulled out his final folder. This one contained the evidence that would tie together all the previous revelations into a comprehensive picture of systemic corruption, rooted in Omar's Minneapolis political base. Congresswoman, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the back of the room. Let's talk about how you actually got elected, because your rise to power wasn't through grassroots organizing. It was through a corrupt political machine built on voter fraud and welfare scams. He displayed the investigative reports on the monitors, the glow of the screens illuminating the stunned faces of the committee members. In 2016, you ran against Phyllis Khan, a longtime incumbent who had served for decades. You won a shocking upset. How? Through what appears to be systematic voter fraud. Bongino pressed a button, and grainy, shaky footage filled the screens. It was the undercover video released by Project Veritas. This footage shows ballot harvesting operations in Minneapolis. You see the cash being exchanged for ballots. You see the community organizers collecting hundreds of absentee ballots from a single address. Those are your campaign workers, Congresswoman, caught on camera, coordinating the operation. Bongino walked the committee through the evidence methodically, his voice a low rumble of accusation. Voter registration records show over 1,000 registrations from the same address in the Cedar Riverside complex. Dead people on the rolls, duplicate registrations, non-citizens registered to vote. And the result? Your political base in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood reported a voter turnout of 97%. He paused, letting that impossible number hang in the air. 97%. That is statistically impossible without fraud. In the history of free elections, you do not get 97% turnout. For comparison, the highest legitimate turnout in United States presidential history was 81% in 1876. You want us to believe you outperformed the most engaged electorate in history by 16 points. Or is it more likely that the ballots were filled out by operatives, not voters? Poll watchers reported intimidation, Bongino continued, reading from sworn affidavits. They reported exclusion. They reported ballots being filled out in groups, with translators marking the choices for the voters. People were being paid to vote. This is machine politics. This is Tammany Hall-style corruption transported to Minneapolis in the 21st century. But the most damning evidence concerned the money that fueled this machine. Bongino switched the display to a complex flowchart showing money moving from state coffers into private bank accounts. Minnesota authorities investigated massive welfare fraud in the Somali community. The Feeding Our Future scandal. Over $250 million in fraudulent daycare and food program claims. Money meant to feed hungry children during the pandemic. Instead, it was used to buy luxury cars, real estate in Kenya and Turkey, and to fund political campaigns. Bongino's voice hardened into granite. And guess whose campaign workers and family members kept appearing in these fraud investigations? Yours, Congresswoman. You employed convicted fraudsters. You received donations from people indicted in this scheme. You advocated for them. You visited them in prison. Why does your campaign staff keep getting convicted of fraud? Is it a coincidence? Or is it the culture you have created where fraud is the norm? He laid out the full pattern, his hands sweeping over the table covered in documents. Immigration fraud, your marriages; tax fraud, your returns; campaign finance fraud, your spending; voter fraud, your elections; welfare fraud, your network. Do you see the pattern, Congresswoman? Do you see the picture these documents paint? Bongino leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. You came to America as a refugee. This country gave you shelter. It gave you freedom. It gave you the opportunity to rise to the highest legislative body in the land. And your response has been systematic fraud at every level. You are not a victim. You are a con artist who has gotten away with it for too long because media and political allies protected you based on your identity. He stood up, gathering all his documents into a single, massive stack. The sound of the papers coming together was like a gavel strike. Mr. Chairman, based on the evidence presented today, I am calling for criminal investigations by the Department of Justice into immigration fraud, tax fraud, campaign finance fraud, and potential voter fraud. I am calling for immediate House Ethics Committee proceedings. I am calling for this committee to recommend expulsion from Congress. The room erupted. It wasn't a murmur this time, it was a roar. Republican committee members were nodding, some even pounding the table in agreement. Democrats looked shell-shocked, staring at the documents, unable to find a procedural maneuver to defend the indefensible. The clerk was frantically typing. Omar's voice cut through the noise, barely audible, trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. This is a racist attack. You are attacking me because I am a Muslim woman. No, Congresswoman. Bongino cut her off, his voice booming over the commotion, silencing the room one last time. This is accountability. It is something you have avoided your entire career, but not anymore. The evidence is now public. The American people know what you are, and justice is coming. The hearing had lasted nearly 5 hours. Dan Bongino had systematically dismantled the career, reputation, and freedom of Ilhan Omar with nothing but documented evidence. Now, he prepared to deliver his final statement for the record. Ladies and gentlemen, Bongino began, looking directly into the camera lens, addressing the millions watching at home. What you have witnessed today is the most comprehensive exposure of political corruption in modern American history. We have documented immigration fraud, marrying an alleged brother for legal benefits; tax fraud, filing false returns; campaign finance fraud, stealing nearly $3 million from donors; anti-Semitism, repeated hateful rhetoric; foreign allegiances, loyalty to Somalia over America; terror sympathies, minimizing 9/11 and supporting hostile regimes; voter fraud, corrupt election practices; and systematic welfare fraud networks enriching themselves through stolen taxpayer money. This isn't about Congresswoman Omar's religion, her race, or her refugee status. This is about systematic criminal conduct spanning over a decade across multiple categories of federal and state law. Bongino's eyes were intense, unblinking. I want to speak to the families watching whose loved ones served America honorably, to the immigrants who came here legally, waited in line, paid their fees, and followed the rules, to the campaign donors whose money was stolen to pay for romantic vacations, to the Jewish Americans who have been attacked with anti-Semitic rhetoric, to the taxpayers whose money funded welfare fraud. Today, we prove that in America, no one is above the law. Evidence defeats identity politics. Truth defeats protected narratives. Accountability defeats media cover-ups. He turned to Omar one final time. She refused to look at him, staring down at her hands. Congresswoman, you came to America with nothing and were given everything. You betrayed that trust at every opportunity. You enriched yourself through fraud. You showed loyalty to foreign countries over America. You aligned with enemies of our nation. You attacked Jews with anti-Semitic tropes. You corrupted elections. You stole from donors. Your career is over. Your protection is gone. Justice is coming. The committee room fell silent as Bongino collected his documents, placing them back into his briefcase with a sharp click. Chairman Jordan announced that criminal referrals would be made immediately to the Department of Justice. The House Ethics Committee would open investigations. Omar would be stripped of committee assignments pending review. As cameras captured Omar leaving the hearing room, the image was searing. She was flanked by lawyers, her face streaked with tears, pushing through the crowd. It was clear that Dan Bongino had accomplished something remarkable. He had held one of the most protected politicians in America accountable using nothing but documented evidence and the courage to present it. The immediate aftermath of the hearing created a political earthquake that would fundamentally reshape American politics forever. Within the first 60 minutes after Chairman Jordan gavelled the hearing to a close, the footage had already been viewed over 10 million times across social media platforms. And that number would explode exponentially in the hours to come. The scene outside the Rayburn building was absolute chaos. Reporters from every major news network had descended on the location, their satellite trucks creating a traffic jam that stretched for blocks down Independence Avenue. Camera crews fought for position, creating a wall of lenses and microphones. As Ilhan Omar emerged from the building, surrounded by a phalanx of staffers and lawyers, the questions came like a hailstorm. "Congresswoman, will you respond to the allegations?" shouted a Fox News reporter. "Are you going to resign?" yelled a correspondent from the Daily Caller. "What about the DNA test? Will you take it?" came a third question from an independent journalist. Omar said nothing. She kept her head down, pushing through the crowd to a waiting black SUV. The door slammed shut, and the vehicle sped away with a police escort, leaving behind a media-feeding frenzy that would dominate news cycles for days. The contrast with her arrival that morning, confident, aggressive, ready to destroy another conservative critic, couldn't have been more stark. She had arrived as a prosecutor. She was leaving as a defendant. Meanwhile, Dan Bongino emerged from a different exit to face his own media scrum, but the atmosphere was completely different. Conservative outlets were treating him like a conquering hero, a gladiator who had entered the arena and slain the beast. But even mainstream journalists, the ones who had spent years dismissing conservative critics of Omar, had to acknowledge the shift. They had to acknowledge the documents. "Mr. Bongino," a CNN reporter called out, "do you believe Congresswoman Omar will face criminal charges?" Bongino's response was measured, professional, the voice of the investigator. "That's not for me to decide. I presented evidence. Now it's up to law enforcement and prosecutors to do their jobs. But I will say this. If any regular American committed the acts I documented today, if you did it or if I did it, we would already be in handcuffs. Let's see if she gets equal treatment under the law." Within 3 hours of the hearing's conclusion, social media had exploded in ways that broke previous records for political content. Omar Exposed was trending #1 worldwide with over 800 million impressions. Bongino Destroys hit 600 million. Drain the Swamp resurged with 400 million. The footage was being shared, dissected, and discussed across every platform. TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. It was everywhere. But what was most remarkable was that the conversation wasn't just happening in conservative echo chambers. Liberal commentators who had spent years defending Omar were now forced to grapple with the documented evidence. They couldn't just dismiss it as hate speech anymore. The receipts were there, the marriage certificates, the tax returns, the FEC filings, the Minnesota board findings. The Democratic Party's response in those first hours revealed a party in absolute crisis mode. Speaker Pelosi, who had protected Omar for years, issued a carefully worded statement that said everything by saying nothing. The House takes all allegations of misconduct seriously and will allow proper investigative processes to proceed. We believe in due process for all members. Translation: Omar was on her own. The shield was gone. The squad's response was more illuminating. AOC tweeted within an hour, standing in solidarity with Ilhan against coordinated right-wing attacks. But notably, she didn't address any of the specific evidence. She didn't mention the marriage. She didn't mention the money. Rashida Tlaib called the hearing an Islamophobic witch hunt, but similarly avoided discussing the documents. Ayanna Pressley was simply silent. Even more telling was what happened behind closed doors. According to sources who leaked information to conservative media outlets, senior Democrats had held emergency conference calls within hours of the hearing ending. The message from party leadership was clear. Don't defend the specifics. Don't talk about the evidence. Just express general support for due process and change the subject to Republican extremism. But the evidence presented by Bongino was too detailed, too well documented, and too damning to be swept aside with procedural platitudes. By the 24-hour mark, the hearing footage had been viewed over 100 million times across all platforms, making it the most watched congressional testimony in history. It surpassed the Trump impeachment hearings. It surpassed the Kavanaugh confirmation battle. This was different. Those previous moments had been, he said, she said, disputes. Bongino had presented documents, facts. Within 48 hours, the institutional responses began. The Department of Justice announced that it was reviewing materials related to potential violations of federal law regarding immigration fraud and campaign finance violations. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division confirmed it was examining concerns about foreign influence. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division opened a file on potential tax fraud. Minnesota state authorities announced they were reopening multiple investigations. The House Ethics Committee, despite its reputation for moving slowly, announced an immediate investigation with rare bipartisan support. Even Democrats on the committee, recognizing the political impossibility of appearing to protect Omar after what had been revealed, voted for the probe. Chairman Jordan announced that Omar would be immediately stripped of her committee assignments pending the investigation's conclusion, a humiliating demotion that effectively ended her ability to influence legislation. By 72 hours after the hearing, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Omar's campaign infrastructure was collapsing in real time. Major donors sent letters demanding refunds, threatening legal action if their money had been used for personal expenses. Progressive organizations that had championed her began quietly removing her from their websites. Her congressional colleagues began avoiding her in the Capitol hallways. The political calculation was simple and brutal. Association with Omar was now toxic. Primary challengers in Minnesota's 5th District began announcing their campaigns. Don Samuels, who had nearly defeated Omar in 2022, announced he was running again, promising the most well-funded primary challenge in Minnesota history. But perhaps most significantly, the hearing had broken through the media's protective bubble. The Washington Post assigned a team of investigative journalists to examine the documents. The New York Times ran articles with headlines like, "Questions mount about Representative Omar's financial practices." Even MSNBC began running segments examining troubling allegations. David Steinberg, the investigative journalist who had spent years researching Omar's background and had been dismissed and deplatformed, suddenly found his phone ringing with interview requests from outlets that had previously refused to cover his work. "I documented all of this years ago," he told Fox News. But nobody would listen because they were more interested in protecting a member of the squad than in reporting the truth. Dan Bongino did in 5 hours what the media should have done 5 years ago. For Dan Bongino himself, the 72 hours after the testimony transformed him from a commentator into a political phenomenon. His podcast downloads increased by 400%. His website crashed from traffic. Speaking invitations poured in. But Bongino remained focused on the bigger picture. In an interview, he made it clear, "People keep asking me if I'm satisfied. I'm not here for personal vindication. I'm here because our political system has been corrupted by people who use their identity as a shield against accountability." Ilhan Omar is just one example. There are dozens more. "What I proved today," he continued, "is that the protection ends when someone has the courage to present the evidence. When you have documents, when you have facts, the defensive shield collapses. And that's what terrifies the political establishment. Because if one person can do it, others will follow." 6 months after Dan Bongino destroyed Ilhan Omar in that congressional hearing room, the landscape of American politics had been fundamentally transformed. The federal courthouse in Minneapolis had become the center of what legal analysts were calling the most significant political corruption trial since the 1980s. Ilhan Omar, the woman who had once been untouchable, now sat at the defendant's table facing a staggering 47-count indictment. The charges included immigration fraud, tax evasion, wire fraud, campaign finance violations, making false statements to federal authorities, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. The indictment read like a comprehensive criminal enterprise prosecution, detailing systematic fraud spanning over 15 years. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the documentary evidence Bongino had presented. Legal experts noted that the strength of the documents made this an unusually straightforward prosecution. "Usually in political corruption cases, you're dealing with intent," explained former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy. "But in the Omar case, the documents tell the story. You have official marriage records. You have FEC filings. The defense has very little room to maneuver." The trial itself was a media spectacle. The prosecution methodically presented the evidence. Former Secret Service agents testified. Forensic accountants walked the jury through the money trail. But the most devastating testimony came from members of the Minneapolis Somali community who had previously been too afraid to speak. Protected by witness security protocols, they provided first-hand accounts of the ballot harvesting, the welfare fraud networks, and the intimidation tactics. One elderly Somali man told the jury, "In our community, everyone knew. We knew Ahmed Elmi was her brother. We knew the marriage was fake. But we were afraid to speak because if you criticized her, you were called a traitor." The jury deliberated for just 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on 43 of the 47 counts. Omar's face remained impassive as the verdict was read, but tears streamed down her cheeks. Her sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, with analysts predicting between 8 and 12 years in federal prison. But the Omar prosecution was just the beginning. The Bongino effect had triggered a wave of accountability. Similar investigations had been launched against a dozen other members of Congress. Representative Cori Bush found herself under investigation for payments to her husband's security firm. Representative Rashida Tlaib faced scrutiny about residency. Even some Republicans were not immune. The new standard was clear. Accountability based on documentary evidence applied to everyone. Dan Bongino had become a symbol of this movement. His book, Taking Down the Frauds, How Evidence Defeated Identity Politics*, debuted at number 1. The Bongino Institute for Government Accountability had been established to train investigative journalists. Sitting in his home studio 6 months later, surrounded by folders of evidence on other politicians, Bongino reflected on the victory. "People ask if I feel vindicated. I don't think about vindication. I think about all the years she stole from donors and defrauded taxpayers. I think about how many other politicians are doing the exact same thing." He gestured to the stacks of folders. "Each one of these represents another corrupt politician. Some are Democrats, some Republicans. But they all have one thing in common. They've been stealing from the American people. And they've gotten away with it because nobody had the courage to present the evidence." The Omar hearing proved that evidence defeats narrative. Facts overcome accusations of bigotry. He pulled out one particularly thick folder. This one is a sitting senator. This one is a governor. This one is a big city mayor. All of them are corrupt. All of them have documentary evidence of their crimes sitting in public records, but not anymore. Because here is what I learned. When you do your homework, when you present the evidence, they can't stop you. He leaned back, a slight, satisfied smile playing on his lips. Omar made the fatal mistake of attacking me personally. She thought her usual tactics would work, call the critic a racist, claim victimhood, but I didn't back down. I had the training. I had the evidence. And she learned the hard way that in America, when you go after someone like that, you better be clean yourself. Because if you're not, the evidence will destroy you. The broader political implications were clear. Progressive politicians found identity politics increasingly ineffective as a shield. Critics were responding with, "Prove it." The campaign finance reform movement gained momentum. Immigration fraud investigations increased. But most importantly, the Omar case restored faith that accountability was possible. As Bongino wrapped up the interview, he returned to his core theme. This was never about Ilhan Omar as an individual. It was about a system corrupted by identity politics. What we proved is that the system can be broken. Evidence can overcome narrative. Truth, when presented with courage, will always win. He stood gathering the folders. I'm not done investigating. I'm not done exposing corruption. And neither are the thousands of people inspired by this. We're building a movement. Ilhan Omar's career is over. She'll spend years in prison. But more importantly, every other corrupt politician in America just learned that their protection has limits. That evidence defeats identity politics. And that, Bongino concluded, is how you drain the swamp, not with rhetoric, but with evidence, courage, and the refusal to back down. The message was unmistakable. The era of protection was over. Someone with the courage to compile documents was coming for you. The swamp was deeper than anyone imagined, but it wasn't impossible to drain. Smash that like button if justice was served. Subscribe for more investigations into political corruption. Share this story everywhere because the establishment doesn't want you to know that accountability is still possible. Comment below which corrupt politician should be investigated next. The files are ready and the next takedown is coming. God bless the investigators who care about truth more than popularity. God bless the citizens demanding accountability. God bless everyone who still believes that in America, evidence matters more than identity and that courage can overcome any corrupt system. This is what happens when authentic Americans stand up to political corruption. This is what happens when someone has the skills to investigate and the courage to present the evidence. This is what happens when truth defeats narrative. The Omar case proved it can be done. Now watch as it happens again and again, until every corrupt politician in America learns that their protection is gone, their shield has collapsed, and accountability is coming for them.